For the promise of a Swiss bank account and a life he would never live, Colonel Pyotr Volkov sold the lives of 800 men. Judas asked for 30 pieces of silver. The colonel was promised $100,000. The file is dated December 23, 1942. The location, a nameless ravine 15 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The scene it describes is not a battlefield. It is a morgue, open to the sky. A Soviet rifle regiment was sent into this valley. Not one man walked out. The snow is not white. It is a ragged carpet of crimson and ash. German machine gun nests positioned on the high ground had created a perfect kill zone. The bodies below are frozen in the postures of their last moments. It was not a fight. It was a systematic execution. When the NKVD special investigators arrived, the wind was the only thing moving. They were not there to count the dead, they were there to hunt a ghost. The German ambush was too precise, too perfectly timed. They knew the exact route, the exact numbers, the exact time of the assault. Someone had handed them the plan. How does it come to this? How does a decorated officer of the Red Army orchestrate the slaughter of his own soldiers? To understand this, we must go back 3 weeks. To the nerve center of the Stalingrad front, in early December 1942, Colonel Pyotr Volkov was an invisible man. His official file is thin, a staff officer, a cartographer. He was a man who drew the lines on the maps where other braver men would go to die. He was surrounded by the architects of the great Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, men whose names would soon be legend. Volkov was not one of them. He was a cog in the great machine, efficient, overlooked, and deeply corrosively resentful. Declassified Abwehr records show the first contact was made on December 5th. It was not dramatic. It was a simple professional transaction. A note passed through a cutout, a signal in a bombed-out building. Volkov was now in contact with Major Klaus Richter, an officer of German military intelligence. A man who understood that the most effective weapon in this war was not a tank. It was weakness. Their first exchange was a test, a trial run. Volkov provided the route and schedule for a small supply convoy carrying winter uniforms. 2 days later, a brief report landed on a Soviet general's desk. The convoy had been annihilated by a German airstrike. In the chaos of Stalingrad, the loss of a few trucks was a rounding error. No one launched an investigation, no one suspected a thing. But for Volkov and for the Germans, it was everything. The test was a success, the channel was secure. Volkov had proven his access and his willingness. Major Richter now knew he had a reliable asset inside the Soviet headquarters. The door was open, and behind it lay the detailed plans for a major offensive. An offensive that, if betrayed, would not just cost a few trucks, it would cost a regiment. The heart of the Stalingrad front was a labyrinth of bunkers buried deep beneath the frozen earth. Here, the air was stale, thick with the smell of cheap tobacco, sweat, and the constant low hum of telegraph machines. It was a place of absolute trust, born from the shared reality of imminent death. Every man depended on the man next to him. It was in this sanctuary of brotherhood that Colonel Volkov prepared his ultimate betrayal. On December 20th, 1942, the final operational maps were brought into the central planning room. They were a work of art and death. Every trench, every artillery position, every planned axis of advance was marked with cold precision. Volkov, in his capacity as a senior cartographer, was granted access. He was there to make final copies for the field commanders. His hands were steady as he handled the documents. No one saw the tremor deep within him. His handler, Major Richter, was a psychologist who wore a German uniform. His messages were not demands, they were seductions. He never spoke of treason. He spoke of reinsurance, of a post-war arrangement. He painted a vivid picture of a quiet life in Zurich, of a world away from the blood and the snow. The price for this future was laid out in a coded transmission. 100,000 American dollars, deposited upon receipt of actionable intelligence. For Volkov, a man who earned less than $100 a month, it was a figure from another universe. It was the price of a soul. The moment came late that night. The planning room was empty save for a single guard in the corridor. The only sounds were the distant rumble of artillery and the frantic beating of Volkov's own heart. The documents lay under a single harsh lamp on a massive oak table. In his pocket, his hand closed around a gift from his German friends. A cigarette lighter, a marvel of engineering. It produced a flame, but its true purpose was contained within its brass shell. A high-resolution microfilm camera. Every movement was a calculated risk. He retrieved the documents. He laid them flat on a secondary table away from the direct line of sight from the door. The sound of the guards' boots in the hallway was a drumbeat of approaching doom. Volkov held his breath. The boots faded. He began his work. One by one, he photographed the maps, the plan of attack, the troop dispositions, the schedule, the designated fallback positions. Each click of the shutter was a death sentence, a quiet metallic sound that condemned dozens of men to a frozen grave. He was not just a traitor. He was an executioner, signing the orders in secret. He finished in under 10 minutes. The film was a tiny roll, no bigger than his fingertip. It was concealed within the lighter. The documents were returned to their original position. No one would know they had been disturbed. Volkov walked out of the planning room, nodding to the guard. He was once again the invisible man, the humble cartographer. But in his pocket he carried the fate of an entire regiment. The devil's bargain had been struck. The price had been paid in advance with blood that was not his own. The transfer of the film was an act of sterile simplicity, a hollowed-out book, left on a bench in a designated ruin. By the next morning, it was gone. The intelligence was now in the hands of the German 6th Army Command. For them, it was not a piece of paper. It was a godsend. It was a perfectly drawn map to a shooting gallery. Colonel Volkov received his confirmation in a coded radio broadcast, a line from a Pushkin poem, followed by a sequence of numbers. His money was waiting. All that remained was for the blood to be spilled. Night, December 23, 1942. The 1st Battalion of the 71st Rifle Regiment moved through the ravine. Nearly 1,000 men. They were the tip of the spear in a localized offensive designed to secure a critical flank. The intelligence reports promised light resistance, a skeleton crew of German defenders caught by surprise. The soldiers moved with the quiet confidence of men who believed they held the advantage. The cold was a physical presence. It bit at any exposed skin and made the metal of their rifles painful to touch. The snow under their boots was the only sound in the suffocating silence. It was a silence that felt wrong, too deep, too complete. Veterans in the ranks exchanged uneasy glances. The air was heavy with an unspoken tension, the feeling of 1,000 unseen eyes watching from the darkness. They reached the designated point of attack, the very center of the valley floor. The flare that was meant to signal the start of their assault never went up. Instead, the night itself exploded. The first German machine gun opened fire from the ridge to their left, then another from the right, a third head-on. Within seconds, they were trapped in a triangulated field of fire. MG-42s, weapons the soldiers called Hitler's buzzsaw, tore through their ranks. The sound was a terrifying, continuous ripping of the air. Mortar shells began to fall, their explosions pluming black and red against the white snow. There was no cover, no way to advance, no way to retreat. They were exactly where Volkov's maps had told the Germans they would be. The attack lasted 47 minutes. It was not a battle. It was a methodical eradication. The Soviet soldiers, blinded by the muzzle flashes and deafened by the constant roar, died without ever seeing the enemy. By the time the firing stopped, the silence that returned was absolute. It was the silence of the grave. Back at headquarters, the first reports were met with disbelief. A communications breakdown, a delay. Then a single terrified radio operator from a support unit miles away reported what he had seen through his field glasses, an entire valley lit by unending gunfire. And then nothing. The regiment had vanished from the ether. The atmosphere in the command bunker turned from shock to ice. A failure of this magnitude could not be a coincidence. It was not a tactical blunder. It was a surgical decapitation. The word was not spoken, but it hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Treason. An hour later, he arrived, the man from the NKVD. He was not a general. He wore a simple, unmarked uniform. His name was not important. His function was. He was an investigator, a man whose entire existence was dedicated to finding the rot within the system. He walked into the command center and the temperature seemed to drop further. His eyes were flat like chips of granite. He did not speak. He observed. He listened. The hunt had begun. Colonel Volkov stood with the other staff officers, his face a mask of grim concern. He offered theories. A German patrol stumbling on them by chance. A failure of their own reconnaissance. Inside his heart was a block of ice. He had done it. He had delivered. And now he was trapped in a sealed bunker with the one man on Earth whose sole purpose was to find him and put a bullet in his head. The NKVD investigation began not with a bang, but with a whisper. The investigator, a man known in the files only as Major Voronov, was a creature of shadow and silence. He did not conduct mass arrests. He did not stage dramatic interrogations. His method was far more terrifying. He began a systematic full-spectrum security review of the entire command staff. It was a slow, bureaucratic strangulation. Personnel files previously gathering dust were re-examined. Every commendation was scrutinized. Every past reprimand was given new weight. Every friendship was a potential liability. Schedules were cross-referenced. Leaves of absence were confirmed. The investigator was not looking for a single clue. He was searching for a single tiny anomaly in the fabric of military routine. An officer who was somewhere he shouldn't have been. A man with access he didn't need. For the officers in the headquarters, the atmosphere became claustrophobic. The unspoken accusation hung in the smoke-filled air of every bunker. Comrades who had shared bread and vodka now looked at each other with a flicker of suspicion. A careless word, a nervous tick, a moment of distraction. Anything could be misinterpreted. It was a reign of quiet terror, and Colonel Volkov was at its epicenter. He played his part to perfection. He was diligent. He was vocal in his outrage. He cursed the German pigs and the traitorous snake who had sold out the 71st Regiment. Every morning he looked in the mirror and practiced the expression of a loyal patriot. But the strain was beginning to show. The files state that he developed a nervous tremor in his left hand. He began smoking twice as much. He avoided conversations, claiming he was overworked. The paranoia was a physical thing, a cold weight in his stomach. He was a ghost, haunting the scene of his own future crime. Meanwhile, beyond the suffocating confines of the Soviet headquarters, the tide of the entire war was turning. The great Soviet pincer movement, Operation Uranus, had been a stunning success. The German Sixth Army, once the unstoppable conqueror of Stalingrad, was now itself encircled, trapped, starving, freezing to death in the ruins they had created. Inside that cauldron of despair was Major Klaus Richter. The pragmatic, confident intelligence officer was now just another cornered animal. The promises he had made to Volkov were meaningless. The life of comfort in Zurich was a fever dream. The only future he could see was a Soviet interrogation cell, followed by a shallow, unmarked grave. But Richter was a survivor. His entire profession was built on the cold calculus of survival. He had one last asset, one final card to play. He knew the name of a high-level traitor inside the Soviet command. To the NKVD, such a prize would be invaluable. It would be a major intelligence victory, and for the man who delivered it, it could be a ticket to life. Perhaps not freedom, but life. In the final days of January 1943, as the last German resistance in Stalingrad crumbled, Major Richter made his decision. There was no loyalty among spies. There was only leverage. He would not protect his source. He would sell him. Just as Volkov had sold his comrades for money, Richter would now sell Volkov for a few more years of his own miserable existence. He meticulously destroyed all of his other records, but he kept one name safe in his memory. The name of Colonel Pyotr Volkov. He was preparing his confession, his ultimate betrayal. The end of the German Sixth Army was a landscape of apocalyptic despair. By early February 1943, the fighting was over. The survivors were skeletal figures crawling out of frozen cellars to surrender. What is the value of a single starving German major? In truth, very little, unless he has something to trade. Major Klaus Richter was found in a cellar beneath a ruined department store. He was suffering from frostbite and severe malnutrition. His surrender was not heroic. It was the calculated act of a man who had already moved on to the next phase of his personal war. Survival. Interrogation Protocol number 734 makes for chilling reading. It is a transcript of the conversation between Richter and the NKVD investigator Major Voronov. For the first 2 days, Richter offered nothing of value. Names of low-level collaborators. Outdated troop movements. He was testing the waters. He was evaluating his interrogator. Then, on the 3rd day, he played his ace. He did not confess. He did not beg. He made a business proposition. The file quotes him, paraphrased from the translator's notes. "You are hunting a leak regarding the 71st Regiment," he stated. "Your search is too broad. You are wasting time." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I can help you narrow your search, as a gesture of professional courtesy." Major Voronov gave no reaction, but he was listening. Richter did not give him a name. That would have been amateurish. It would have ended his usefulness. Instead, he gave Voronov a set of parameters. The traitor, he explained, was not a frontline commander. He was a staff officer. He worked in the cartography and operational planning department. He had access to final draft assault maps, but was not senior enough to be involved in their creation. And he was a man who felt he had been repeatedly passed over for promotion. It was a masterclass in betrayal. Richter had painted a perfect silhouette of Colonel Volkov without ever speaking his name. He had given the NKVD a blueprint to find their man. In return, he asked for nothing immediately. He simply requested that his cooperation be noted in his file. He was planting a seed for his own survival, watering it with Volkov's life. For Major Voronov, this information was a lightning strike. The investigation, which had been a slow, painstaking process of sifting through hundreds of personnel files, was now transformed. The search parameters had been defined. He returned to headquarters. The list of potential suspects, once numbering over 200, was reduced to just 5 men. 5 officers who fit every single one of Richter's criteria. Colonel Pyotr Volkov was number 3 on that list. The nature of the surveillance changed overnight. It was no longer passive observation. It was an intense, focused hunt. Agents, disguised as clerks and orderlies, were assigned to watch each of the 5 men. Their movements were tracked. Their conversations were noted. Their personal effects were slated for clandestine searches. Volkov could feel the shift. The polite nods in the hallway seemed to hold a new meaning. The silences felt heavier. The eyes of his comrades lingered a moment too long. He was no longer just a suspect in a general investigation. He was a primary target. The net had not just tightened. It was now a cage, and the walls were 5 men wide. He just didn't know that the executioner who had signed his death warrant was the very man for whom he had committed his treason. The end came on the night of February 25, 1943. For Colonel Volkov, it was just another night of suffocating paranoia. He was attending a late-night strategic briefing, a pointless exercise for a man who knew he was being watched. While he sat there, feigning interest in the movements of phantom armies, 2 of Major Voronov's agents slipped into his personal quarters. They were phantoms themselves, moving with a practiced silence that left no trace. The search was a violation, a silent invasion of a man's last private space. They did not ransack the room, they analyzed it. They checked the loose floorboard. They examined the spine of every book. They felt the seams of his uniform for hidden pockets. The report is clinical. It lists every item they inspected. And for 20 minutes they found nothing. Then one of the agents picked up a small collection of personal effects from the nightstand, a family photograph, a service medal, and a brass cigarette lighter. It was a beautiful piece of German engineering, heavy, ornate, not the kind of thing a typical Red Army officer would own. The agent flicked the switch. A strong flame appeared. He flicked it again. The lighter felt solid, but there was a subtle imbalance to its weight. He twisted the base. It did not move. He tried to pull it. Nothing. Then he applied pressure to a small, almost invisible seam near the top. There was a faint click. The outer casing slid away, revealing the intricate mechanism within. There was no large reservoir for fuel. Instead, nestled in the heart of the device, was a tiny, expertly crafted camera, and next to it, a miniature canister containing a single roll of undeveloped film. The trap had sprung. They did not wait. The 2 agents at the briefing moved in as the meeting concluded. They flanked Colonel Volkov as he stood up to leave. There were no drawn weapons, no raised voices. One of them simply said in a low, flat tone, "Colonel, you will come with us." Witness accounts state that Volkov did not resist. He did not ask why. The entire facade of the loyal officer, the mask he had worn for months, simply disintegrated. His shoulders slumped. His face went pale. The tremor in his hand returned with a violent shudder. There was no struggle. The man they arrested was not a colonel. He was a hollow shell. His confession is a sealed document. The full transcript will likely never be seen, but the summary is brutally concise. Under intense interrogation, he admitted to everything: the contact with the Abwehr, the photographing of the maps, the payment he was promised. He gave them every detail of his treason. The military tribunal was a formality. It lasted less than an hour. The verdict was decided before it began. On March 22, 1943, Pyotr Volkov was marched into the courtyard of the NKVD headquarters. He was stripped of his rank and medals. He faced a firing squad of 3 men. He said nothing. The order was given. The shots echoed briefly against the brick walls, then were swallowed by the vast, indifferent Russian winter. His file was stamped with a single red word: liquidated. And what of the other traitor? Major Klaus Richter, the man who set it all in motion and then sold his agent to save himself? His cooperation was noted. He was deemed a high-value prisoner, an expert on the inner workings of German intelligence. He was not sent to a gulag to die. He was sent to a special camp for valuable assets. He survived the war. He survived for another 20 years, dying of a heart attack in his bed in East Germany. One traitor was executed for his greed. The other was rewarded for his betrayal. That is the final, cold arithmetic of the world of shadows.